Ann. I'm a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and the owner of Peas and Toppiness. I'm going to show you how to prepare tofu today. Tofu is a soy product. It's sort of the equivalent of soy cheese. So the way cheese is made is from cow's milk. You separate the curds in the whey, you drain off the whey, and then you press the curds together. Tofu is really similar to that, except you use soy milk instead of cow's milk. It is a very high protein vegetarian food, and so it's great to include if you are trying to switch to more plant-based options. The challenge is that here in Western culture, we often don't eat very much soy in our traditional diet. And so if you have not prepared soy before, it can be a little bit intimidating because tofu itself is very bland. And this can be either good or bad. First of all, if you're not used to it being really bland, then you might be surprised that it doesn't have much flavor. But the good thing about this is that it means that you can put whatever flavor you want into tofu. There are so many options. This is so versatile. So I have two different types of tofu today. Tofu ranges in texture from silken all the way to extra firm. Today I have a firm tofu and an extra firm or super firm tofu. These are the types of tofu that you would want to use if you are trying to fry, bake. We're going to grill actually one of these recipes today. The silken tofu is used in things like pudding, things that are much more soft. Really the difference is the water content in these two items, and so these have the most water that's been pressed out of the tofu to begin with, so it's the most solid. It's going to hold up the best. The texture really does matter, so if a recipe calls for a specific type of texture, then make sure that you purchase the correct one. I have 3 tips to help you get the most flavor out of your tofu. Tip number 1 is actually related to the surface area, so I'm going to prepare this in a couple different ways. Tip number 2 is about pressing the extra liquid out of the tofu, and that is a step that you do not want to miss. And tip number 3 is to use lots of flavor in the recipes. I'll start with my super firm tofu. This is the most firm that you can get out of tofu, and I'm just going to use my chef's knife to sort of create a slit in there. I'm going to drain off any extra water that is in that. There's not a lot. Like I said, extra firm tofu has the least amount of water. But I've drained any extra off, and I'm going to open this. This tofu I'm going to use for a recipe which we're going to grill. So I'm going to slice this tofu into blocks. It's about the same size, any block. It ranges in amount from 14 ounces to like 16 ounces, like a pound of tofu in a block. And so my recipe instructs us to cut it into 6 slices. So I have 6 blocks of tofu. In terms of surface area, this is sort of a time versus size issue. So if you are using a recipe which calls for blocks, which I need to use for the grill because obviously small cubes would not work on the grill, but you can actually place this entire block on the grill. These are going to need a much longer amount of time to marinade, so we are planning these for dinner. Trick number 1 is to increase the surface area if you are trying to make a quick recipe. Option number 1 are the larger tofu pieces, which we are going to marinate for a longer amount of time. If you do not have a lot of time, I will show you this surface area tip to get the most flavor in your tofu. So again, I'm cutting a slit. I'm draining the water off. Once all that water's been drained, I just open my tofu. Now this is just slightly softer because it is firm tofu instead of extra firm. I usually just use extra firm tofu because we like that flavor, but this recipe will work with either kind. So this is something that you can kind of experiment with and you can see which you prefer. This I'm going to cut into small cubes, and that is going to allow me to get away with not cooking it as long. It's also, I'm going to make this recipe crispy. And so tofu is really soft on the inside, and if you're not used to that texture, it can be just a little bit different to get used to. So making fried tofu, ordering it fried in a restaurant, or this is actually a recipe for crispy baked tofu. This is going to change the texture a little bit and give it just a little bit more interest. So I'm cutting these into very small cubes, as you can see, and that is increasing the surface area. Tip number 2 is to press the liquid from your tofu. So I laid those tofu blocks out on a clean towel. You can use paper towels, it just takes a lot of them, so I like to use just a clean dish towel. And then I'm gonna lay that towel, the other half over that, okay? Normally I would just place a second plate on there, and then we would put something heavy on it. Since I have two different types of tofu, my other pro tip is to just stack these plates with as many that you need to get all of your tofu to press at the same time. So here I'm going to set that plate down. I've layered my plate on the other plate. I take another clean dish towel and I'm going to spread these tofu cubes evenly along the towel. This is going to help to press out all of that additional water in these as much as we possibly can, because we don't want that water to displace the flavor. If we can get as much of water out as possible, then it's going to leave more room for our little tofu to soak up all of the delicious flavor that we're going to give it. When you press tofu like this, it needs to sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. Normally what I like to do, I spread all these little tofu pieces out, and then I will fold this other half over my tofu. I'm gonna place my other plate on top of this, and this is where my handy cast iron skillet comes in again. It is very heavy. So literally, I will just place the cast iron skillet on top of my tofu. If you don't have a cast iron skillet, you could set cans of beans or tomatoes or whatever you might have in the cabinet. You can literally set anything heavy on this and just literally let it press out the water for you. So I've got my little deck of tofu and it is just hanging out there. So normally I would let this sit and then I would prep my vegetables or do whatever else I need to in the recipe, and then I'd come back, it's all ready for the next step. If you are short on time, you don't have 10 to 15 minutes, the other thing that you can do is to manually press out the liquid. So I've got all of this set up, and now all I need to do is literally just press my hands on the tofu, and we're just gonna squeeze out as much of that water as we can. You can actually see the water coming out a little bit, and when I take this towel out, you'll really be able to see that it is wet. So I'm gonna take these tofu out. You can see the towel, it is actually wet from the tofu pieces. So that means we've got water out of there. The next step with our tofu is we're going to impart lots of flavor into them. The way I'm gonna make crispy tofu is I have some cornstarch here. We're gonna bake this. You could also fry it. I have a bunch of seasonings that I'm going to add. And this is one of my big pro tips. When you're cooking vegetarian food, you've got to add tons of spices because it does not have as much of what you call umami flavor in the vegetarian foods. Umami comes from what are called glutamates. It's a specific amino acid. And so without those glutamates, you don't have as much of the natural umami flavor, and you need to add other types of flavor. So I have a bunch of spices. I'm adding garlic powder and onion powder and paprika, salt, and black pepper. Now, when I write the recipes for the Peas and Hoppy Meal Guides, I make sure to test all of these vegetarian recipes so that they do actually have enough flavor in them. So if you are just trying to make your chicken dinner with tofu instead of chicken, you'll want to probably double the spices in that. Otherwise, it's best to use a recipe which has been designed for vegetarian cooking because that is going to get you the best flavor. So I'm just tossing this. If you are really, the better you do this, the better results. This cornstarch is a great option to use. You really don't want to use flour with tofu. It just does not work the same, but this is a good way to get it crispy. Tofu it's a really nutritious food, and so especially if you are doing a vegetarian or a vegan diet, it's such a great thing to add. Tofu has all of the essential amino acids that you need, and they are actually very bioavailable. So they are very easy for your body to digest and to get the protein. The soy protein in tofu is actually quite comparable to beef. So if you are thinking about, if you're an athlete and you're worried about getting enough protein from a vegetarian diet, tofu is a great thing to include because it has such high quality, bioavailable, digestible nutrients. It's really a low fat food, and when it comes to things like tofu, so it is very heart healthy. The soy protein has been found to lower your LDL cholesterol, especially if you are substituting tofu in place of foods with animal protein because animal proteins typically include more saturated fat, it is likely going to be a very heart healthy move for you. So this is just 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, 1 teaspoon each of onion powder, garlic powder, paprika, and then a 1/2 teaspoon of salt and pepper. Now we're gonna throw this in the oven at 450, very hot, so that it gets nice and crispy, and we're gonna bake it for about 10 to 15 minutes. So I will set that aside and show you my second recipe. Recipe number 2 was for our grilled tofu. These tofu pieces, since they are bigger, we're gonna wanna give it more time to absorb the marinade. So I already mixed up the marinade. This is a mixture of a lot of things again, because we want lots of flavor. So I have Worcestershire, I have liquid smoke, I have soy sauce, I have minced garlic, onion powder, Dijon mustard. This is a marinade. So I'm gonna put these tofu cubes in my marinade, and then I'm gonna let them sit in our refrigerator until it's time to grill them this evening. You wanna just make sure that they are all soaking up that marinade. And I am actually going to flip those a couple of times while they marinate throughout the day. If you don't have time to marinate them, you could actually bake this and leave these in the marinade while you roast it in the oven, and then it will give that time to soak up all that delicious flavor. We're just gonna let this soak for several hours. The longer the better here, because again, you wanna impart as much flavor. Just to recap, the 3 tips are, number 1, think about the surface area of your tofu. If you have a long time to let your tofu marinate, you can cut it into larger pieces. But if you need it to be quick, then a larger amount of surface area, smaller pieces, is gonna be a lot better. Tip number 2 is to press all of the liquid out of the tofu that you can, so that there's room for your tofu to absorb those other flavors. And then tip number 3 is to use lots of flavors. Use tons of these umami containing ingredients like the Worcestershire sauce that we're using, so that you can get lots of flavor for the tofu, which is basically a blank slate for whatever you like. So if you have more questions about tofu, please drop a comment. I would love to answer more tofu questions. If you want a recipe to try out, I will leave one of my favorite recipes, which is my teriyaki tofu and vegetable bowls. It's super easy to make, so a great place to start if you're new to it. I hope you enjoy lots of tofu, and I hope to catch you again in my kitchen soon. Take care, everybody.